In this video, we are going to talk about after we prove triangles congruent using the fact that we know that all the corresponding parts are congruent to go further with our proofs. So this is based off of the idea that when we know that we have two congruent figures, whether they're triangles or not, that all of their corresponding parts, their sides and angles, are also congruent. So when we have proven that two triangles are congruent using three pieces, either three sets of sides, two sets of sides and an angle, two sets of angles and a side, we've proven they're congruent. So then we know that all of their corresponding parts are congruent because the triangles are congruent. So corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So the shorthand for that is CPCTC. So once we have proven the triangle is congruent, we'll get to decide that we'll know that all of the rest of their parts are congruent as well. So once we get to this congruent statement, right, so you've written that two triangles are congruent, you've proven that, then you know all of these parts. Okay, so for the angles, we know that angle K is congruent to angle H. We know that angle R is congruent to angle W. We know that angle T is congruent to angle M. Then we also know that side KR is congruent to side HW. Side RT is congruent to side WM. And that side KT is congruent to side HM. So now you've already put three of these into your proof to get one of the ways to prove that triangles are congruent. So by side, 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 angle, 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 side, or hypotenuse, leg. Each of these require that you know three of these are already congruent and you've put it in your proof. So then you're just getting three of them for free, so you're utilizing one of the others. So let's take a look here. So now instead of saying prove the triangles are congruent at the end, we're going to try and prove that some of their parts are congruent. Okay, so first thing that you'll do is write down your givens again. Okay, so we've got AB is congruent to AD. And then I'm just actually going to put this has the givens all together. So I'm also going to put in angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And then I'm also going to mark that on the picture. So AB is congruent to AD, and then also angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Then this next reason says that we're going to be using the reflexive property. So if I look at the picture, this middle segment that's shared in both is segment AC. So we'll write AC is congruent to AC, and that is by the reflexive property. This next reason suggests that we're proving triangles are congruent because it's one of our ways to prove triangles is congruent. So triangle ABC is congruent to what other triangle? So the order would be this red arced angle to B to C and then back. So follow that order in the bottom, and it's going to be ADC. So now that and that's by side angle side because we had two sides with those reflexive. Let me just redraw that top triangle so you can see that if you're having trouble seeing it. So that top triangle, we had this side, this angle, and this side marked, and then similar in the bottom for side angle side. So then this CPCTC means that we've got corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So what we're ultimately trying to do is prove that angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. And if you look, okay, this angle 3 is C in the top triangle. Okay, so C in the top triangle. And this angle 4 is angle C in the bottom triangle. We see that those are corresponding spots in our congruent statement. And we can also think about flipping this triangle over on top of the other one and knowing that those two would land on top of each other. So angle 3 is congruent to angle 4 because they are corresponding parts of two congruent triangles. Next one, so go ahead and start with the givens here. So we've got given that angle C is the midpoint of AE and that angle A is congruent to angle E. So we'll write both of those down in here. C is the midpoint of AE. And I'll write angle A is congruent to angle E. And then I'll mark that stuff on the picture. So right now we've got A is congruent to E. Okay. Then the other part has a word in it. Okay, so we're going to have to break down this word. So C is the midpoint of AE. So C is the midpoint or in the middle of A and E, which means that this side is congruent to this side. So pick one of these. So which one is it? And I'll cross off the other one. So this was AC is congruent to CE. Okay, so AC is congruent to CE. That is definition of a midpoint. So we broke down that given. Next justification or reason says vertical angles. So we see the vertical angles here as angle 1 and angle 2. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Next statement says which two triangles are congruent. So we must be ready to prove the triangles are congruent. So ABC I'm going to start with for my first one. So ABC, the order that would follow in the bottom triangle would be EDC. And how do we know? Well, we've got two angles and the side between. So two angles and the side between. Again, if you want to redraw a triangle to be able to look at it without as much stuff written, it looks like this. So you've got those two angles and that in-between side. So that would be angle, side, angle. So now ultimately, now we need to think about what we want to prove. So we want to be proving that C is actually the midpoint of BD. So if C was the midpoint of BD, what we would see, so if I just write down this stuff, so if C is to be the midpoint of BD, that would mean that we would need to see this piece congruent to this piece. So we would need to know that. Okay, so we need to know that BC is congruent to CD. And do we know that? Okay, and how? So if you look here, BC congruent to CD or DC. Okay, yes, because they are corresponding parts of those congruent triangles. So they have to be congruent. So we see that those two chunks are congruent by CPCTC. That forces C to be the midpoint because of the definition of a midpoint.